sharp inequalities, agrarian distress, and malnutrition. And over the past decade, low rates of employment generation has been rising at an alarming rate. In addition, the COVID-19 pandemic triggered unemployment and exposed the failures of the state further. Center for Economic Data and Analysis reported that India's unemployment rate rose sharply from 5.27% in 2019 to 7.11% in 2020. Moreover, the Indian economy was already witnessing an economic slowdown before the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. As such, India's capacity to deal with the larger issues brought on by the onslaught of the COVID-19 pandemic was significantly hindered. The rising question then formulates as to what explains such contradictions. To understand the roots of the issues, one must look at it through historical lens and investigate the political economy of India's development experience. Hence, in this three-part lecture series by Professor Venkatesh Athreya aims to deal with these broad questions and to provide a comprehensive yet critical perspective of India's development experience since 1947. Now, let me introduce our esteemed speaker, Professor Venkatesh Athreya. Professor Venkatesh Athreya is a development economist and served as a professor of economics at Bharatidasn University, Tamil Nadu, for nearly 3 decades. Professor Athreya has held positions in a number of reputed academic institutions in India, and which includes University of Wisconsin, Oxford University, University of Cambridge, London University, IIT Madras, Madras Institute of Development Studies, and Center for Development Studies. As a public intellectual and activist, he has also held important responsibilities in public life, having been part of the past president of the All India People's Science Network and of Tamil Nadu Science Forum, executive committee member of Bharat Gyan Vigyan Samiti and National Literacy Mission Authority of Government of India. He has written extensively on agrarian change, food security, human development, and political economy. He was the lead author of the report on the state of food insecurity in rural India in 2008 and the report on the state of food insecurity in urban India 2010. He has also won a number of awards and honors, including Distinguished Achievement Award for Political Economy in the 21st Century by the World Association of Political Economy in May 2014. On this note, I now welcome and invite Professor Venkatesh Athreya to begin the lecture series.
Hi. Should we wait for Gautam? Or that's it? I go ahead or?
Yes, you can go ahead.
Yeah, okay. First of all,
Yes, Gautam is here.
congratulate the
Rajma.
ESF team at TESS for this sustained effort at educating ourselves collectively at a time when it's difficult to meet physically. They have utilized the limited options available to you under the pandemic to continue this effort to sustain ourselves with intellectual inputs that are relevant to the challenges we face today. And I think what brings all of us together is a commitment to see a better India. That I think is what fundamentally signifies PSFTIS, students' rights, of course, but also larger welfare of Indian people and more generally, progressive change in society. Let me also say that these 3 lectures try to compress in a limited amount of time a vast amount of material, and therefore I will necessarily be brief on many of these important issues that need more elaborate treatment simply for lack of time. Also, I should say that in a country of India's nature, the axis of inequality pertain to class, caste, and gender, and of course region. And I will not be able to go into all these aspects. For example, social oppression, the deprivation of the Dalits and the scheduled tribes, interregional inequalities, the serious attack on federalism that we are facing and seeing, and so on. So there are many, many things that I won't be able to cover simply because it would not be possible to cover them in any depth. Therefore, I will primarily stick to a broad macroeconomic presentation from an analytical and historical perspective on India's economic development since independence. This is really the more narrow frame. And even that is quite a heroic attempt because India is so heterogeneous. There are parts of India to which whatever I'm saying will not apply, and this is bound to be the case. In fact, well-known economist, the late Joan Robinson, once said, I think she was quoting somebody else, that for any statement that you make, which is true about India, its opposite will also be true. That's the complexity of our society. So I'm going to be necessarily speaking in aggregate terms, and that may miss out on many of the finer aspects of our very complex economy and its challenges. But nonetheless, this has to be done. One must provide a basic analytical introduction to the historical path of development that we have come through in the last 70 years. We are approaching the 75th year of the Republic. It's an appropriate occasion to look at it. Although currently the regime in power may not be particularly keen to talk about the freedom struggle, not having played any significant part in it. For most of us, it's been a privilege to be part of the Indian state, Indian nation, not of the state, but of the Indian nation, and it's people from several linguistic nationalities and cultures. So we are a multinational state united in the Indian Union. Indian Union is a union of states, a term that some of those who don't like the idea of a truly federal India find offensive. But for me, it's a given that we are a union of states, what the Constitution says, and therefore, one is proud of being Indian. At the same time, one is proud of belonging to a particular linguistic nationality, not and seek to advance the cause of the people. Okay, now I'm going to divide the post-independence development in these three lectures into essentially chronologically and also analytically into these three distinct phases. First, we'll today cover the period from 1950 to 80. Now, this is not a mere chronological division. There's also certain analytical significance of these points I've chosen, points of time I've chosen, 1950, 1980. Then we will look at the process of liberalization that happens in the 80s, which takes us into the reform, so-called neoliberal reforms period of 1991, which goes on and is with us still, but with an important shift in the center of gravity of power in 2014, because then what we have after that, in some ways distinct ideologically, politically, and economically. Interesting, today we are speaking on the 24th of July, which is been highlighted in the media in terms of 30 years of economic reforms. But just the 19th of July was the day of bank nationalization. To me, a very significant date, 1969, July 19. And of course, the bank employees movement has been highlighting the significance of bank nationalization. So in a sense, we have competing rival narratives right now amongst us as to the path of the Indian economy that is desirable or that has been taken, and so on. So we'll keep that in mind, although we will not necessarily answer every question that may arise in the course of a discussion of this kind. And so we'll start the story at the time of independence. Now, three distinct features marked the period from roughly 1945, the end of the Second World War, through our independence, through at least the early mid-50s, about a decade you might say, 45 to 55 if you like, stretch it to 60 if you like, but the three very important developments in that period were the following. One, if you look back at the world economy, you find that up until 1914, capitalism which arose in the West had more or less an unchallenged period where it could just go and take over territories and peoples and appropriate the resources and rule them till about 1914, 15. But First World War, 14 to 18, brought an interruption in what had been a relatively untrammeled period of globalization led by finance capital from the 1870s onwards, something that Lenin's book on imperialism highlights. But even more important, during the First World War, you had the Russian Revolution in 1917, the October Revolution in particular, in which a certain part of the world's population and territory broke away from the then globally expanding capitalist system and put something of a spoke in the wheel of capitalist expansion. Didn't ultimately stop it, but certainly was a major turn of events. Then you have the period following the end of the First World War, which is one of a short period of a boom in the Western economies, and then followed by a decade-long depression starting in late 20s and going through the 1930s. Interestingly paralleled by an incredibly rapid growth of economy in the Soviet Union, which only in 1928 had regained the Russian region of the USSR, had regained the 1913 levels of output only in 1928. In the next 12 years, it became the second largest industrial power without colonies, without super exploitation of its own workers, without any of the advantages of capturing other people's resources and territory that capitalism had when in its period of expansion prior to that. And so by 1940, there is a credible rival economic system that wasn't even considered feasible when it first arose. Mainstream economics teaches you still that people like von Mises and Hayek and so on said socialism is impossible, right? And Oscar Lange had to write why it is possible. But reality settled all that. And then you had the Second World War, which is again a major problem for the Western world in its continued attempt at global expansion. So the 30-year crisis from 1914 to 1945 for global capitalism coincided with the parallel rise of an alternative social system, especially post-World War II, when a number of East European countries and later China, Vietnam, Korea, and Cuba, and so on followed suit. So you really have these three developments. One is the weakening of the dominant imperial system, not its disappearance by any means, but weakening to some extent. In particular, of European imperialisms, the US imperialists were relatively better off. They didn't have a war on their territory. They, in fact, benefited from the war efforts earlier in terms of their economy, and then subsequently they didn't have to suffer the consequences of war in the way that Europe and other territories of the world had to. So by the end of World War II, they became the most powerful capitalist nation, which they were well on the way to becoming even earlier, but substantially so by the end of World War II. Whereas the old imperial camp was considerably weakened. And this weakening of the imperialist camp had significance for a lot of the countries fighting for liberation from colonial rule. So this is the first important development. Parallel to that is the rise of a socialist camp, which at one point in time in the 50s accounted for about a sixth of the world's territory and about a third of the world's population. These were countries at different stages of development. They had major challenges. Socialism didn't occur in some textbook fashion. So it occurred, revolutions occurred in countries which were extremely backward in many respects, and therefore they had to carry out the tasks that capitalist class had done in other countries, but under socialist relations of production. So that's a far greater challenge. Nonetheless, there was the second important development of a rise of a socialist camp, and the third important development, which followed from these two, in a sense, was, I wouldn't say followed, but was greatly encouraged and supported by these two developments, was the victory across the world of a large number of national liberation movements from colonial rule. So this is the third factor, the liberation from colonial rule, a wave of global decolonization. Not 100%, because we still have Palestine, we still have many, outposts of direct colonial rule. We also have, of course, other forms of colonial exploitation that haven't totally disappeared. Nonetheless, these three developments, the weakening of the imperialist camp, the rise of a powerful socialist camp, and a global way of decolonization. These were important aspects of the international context when India became independent. This context becomes very important because this gives newly independent India's rulers some hope, some confidence that they can attempt, within the limits of this world, a relatively autonomous path of capitalist development. Mind you, this every word here is important. It is capitalist development. So at no point in time any discussion of socialist development in India, contrary to what the Arvind Subramanians of the world are going around saying, we had embarked upon a path of capitalist development at the time we became independent. This includes all the alleged socialists like Jawaharlal Nehru and so on, who was very clear that he was trying to build a modern capitalist economy in India, something that the private capitalist class, given its level of development at that time, was incapable of doing on its own, and therefore the state had to come in a big way. So one was that the global context provided some space, some possibilities, given the rival social systems that existed and how the newly independent countries could use that rivalry as a bargaining device in accessing technology or financial support or other modes of cooperation for development. So India was also in that position of being able to take some advantage of the presence of a socialist camp in relation to its bargaining power vis-a-vis the Western world. Although India initially tended to look to the West in the first couple of years of independence, and only after being rebuffed chose a more balanced path to some extent for some time. This is one part. The global context was favorable for the newly independent, large, diverse country like India with resources and territory and population to seek to embark on a relatively autonomous path of development. But equally important, the domestic situation made the development agenda extremely urgent for the rulers, because the period from 1944 to 47, as the war was drawing to a close and people resumed their struggles in many ways, there were major struggles of the Indian people in the period leading up to independence. I will not, of course, go into all of them, but let me just mention a few that are important. One was there was considerable peasant unrest across the country. We have now a glorious peasant unrest lasting over 7 months at the moment, through a winter and a summer. But at that time, there were peasant struggles across the length and breadth of the land. Would be difficult to go into each one of them, but we can certainly mention the famous armed struggle of the peasantry of Telangana, which lasted for 5 years against the Nizam and his hoodlums. Ultimately, the struggle was brought to an end by the intervention of the Indian armed forces. The Communist Party was leading these struggles, seeking land for the working peasantry and trying to expropriate landlords who were completely unproductive. Nevertheless, that struggle, glorious as it was, ended by 51, but that is a very important landmark struggle. But equally, there was the struggle, the Tebaga struggle in the Bengal region, which is about increasing the share of the sharecropper in the total output. There were other struggles in the Sumer Valley and Assam and so on. And then, of course, also, if you come down and move to the central western part of India, you had this glorious struggle of the Adivasis in Warli in Maharashtra, again under the leadership of the Communist Party, fighting an oppressive colonial government and then the independent Indian government on the question of land rights and how the land doesn't belong to the state, the land of the forest belongs to the people who nurtured those forests for so long. And that struggle of tribals for land is a very, very powerful and glorious one. Then you had, if you come down south, you have Telangana, as we said earlier, but in the area now we know as Kerala, there was this huge struggle of Punapravayala. Martyrs from that are still remembered in Kerala warmly. In what is now Tamil Nadu, you had the struggle of the agricultural laborers who suffered in the eastern Tanjavur region, Kaveri Delta region, both economic exploitation and social oppression. as Dalits were humiliated in various ways. Their struggle, also the tenants there, many of whom belong to what you would call backward caste in the official lexicon, but who were essentially tenants and were being oppressed by the landlords, big landlords of that region. So again, an anti-landlord struggle in which the small peasantry and tenantry were together with the agricultural laborers of that region, cutting across caste lines. Incredible example of intercaste unity of working people against landlord domination, led again by the Communist Party, whether it's Punapravila or Tanjavur or the other ones I mentioned. Invariably, in all these cases, the leadership came from the Communist Party. Congress, being the party that led India to independence, was of course trying to douse the fires for the most part, not was not in the business of supporting working people's struggles. Although in the freedom movement they had made promises like land to the tiller and so on. So that was something they couldn't totally get out of when post-independence, when the agenda came up. So the long and short of what I'm saying is that in the global international context, the weakening of imperial powers and the rise of a socialist camp and the global wave of decolonization presented opportunities for relatively autonomous capitalist development in India. The domestic circumstances compelled the rulers to urgently initiate a process of development, or else face increasingly intense opposition from people across the country. And I think the Indian ruler, the Indian capitalist class certainly realized it. In fact, they came up with planning before the so-called socialists like Nehru came up with planning. I mean, of course, Congress constituted a planning committee as early as 1937 when they came into office in some provinces. But then the Bombay plan came from the Indian capitalist class. But India also had decided by that time to go in for national planning. But what was the common element here between India and many other countries, including some of the advanced capitalist countries, by the way, was that there was a recognition that the state would be an important agent of development. This is no laissez-faire, none of this neoliberal nonsense we hear, or the earlier liberal nonsense of the 19th century. By the way, one must incidentally make the point that at all times in its history, capitalism may have had its ideologues talk about laissez-faire, but the state has always been there as a key player in building capitalism for the capitalists. This is true of the 19th century as much as it is true of 20th century. The scales may be different, but it's important to recognize that the rhetoric of liberalism then, 19th century liberalism or neoliberalism now, is very misleading because the state has been a key force in advancing the interests of the capitalist class throughout its entire history. That's important to just flag that and keep it in mind, although we're not going to go into it now. Coming back to the specific concrete Indian situation, therefore, there was this imperative for the government to move quickly on a development agenda. What was the stake of India? Would it permit such a broad-based initiative from the side of the state for all-round development? Where were the resources to be found? At that time, what was the extent, structure of the economy and the available resources? If you ask these questions, you face a very grim reality that India at independence is extremely backward. It was backward in terms of agriculture, its techniques, levels of productivity, its land utilization, etc., etc., all the usual metrics you might use. Likewise, it is extremely backward in terms of industrial development. You have data from the 1951 census and so on about the proportion of workforce that is in agriculture, roughly about 72% of the workforce is in agriculture and related activities, although agriculture accounts only for 49% of India's GDP at that time. You have likewise about 10% of India's labor force in small and medium unorganized industries, and another 7% in the large-scale industries, about 17%, roughly the In fact, no, this is I'm talking about output. The labor force is even less, much less. Hardly 10% of the labor force was in industry, although labor industry accounted for about 17, 18% of output. And the remaining 34% was services and construction together. And the workforce was likewise mostly in agriculture, almost three quarters, and some in industry, about roughly about same as the share of industry in GDP, and the rest was in the services sector. So essentially, it was an agrarian economy with very low levels of productivity. And what about the? I mean, one can give one or two numbers just to give a feel for the backwardness of India at that time, because for many of you, this is only in imagination. You have not seen it. I myself was born only after independence, shortly after independence, so I myself cannot claim that I knew what things were like at that time. But we do have data, and we can look at a few indicators. For example, the take education, and you have 1951 literacy figures from the census. Hardly 16% of the population was literate in 1951, as per the census data. And census data's reckoning of literacy is a very generous one. It's not real literacy as you would formally understand it. But nevertheless, it was 16%, about 24% among men and 8% among females. And these are national averages. So you can imagine it must have been much more backward in large swaths of territory in areas where currently ruling party at the center plays an important role. And those states where, there could be many villages and districts where you could hardly find a literate person, certainly not a literate female. So very backward in terms of literacy. If there's an indicator, similarly, the same thing would be true of years of schooling or many other educational indicator you could think of. Similarly, if you took health, if you just take two simple indicators, one would be the expectation of life at birth. I always jokingly tell my students that I'm completely an outlier because I was born in the latter part of 1947 after independence, the very end of 1947, and I should have, under the mathematical expectation of life, I should have been there for about 32 years. This includes, of course, a huge infant mortality component. So the things look a little better if you start at age one, and reckon expectation of life. But nonetheless, today we have a much larger expectation of life at birth, closer to 60 plus. So it is definitely a big improvement in that sense. But at that time, expectation of life at birth was hardly 32 years, meaning that the newborn could on the average expect to live only for 32 years. A lot of the deaths took place in the first year of birth, and then it improved a bit after that, but still quite bad, quite backward. If you take another indicator, if you ask the question of 1,000 live borns, how many survived beyond the first year and how many did not? The number which did not survive per 1,000 live born after 1 year is called infant mortality rate, IMR, and it's roughly about 150 at that time when it became independent. Today it's much less. It's still scandalously high in relation to similarly placed nations across the world, but certainly much less than the horrendous figure of 150 in 1947. Today's relatively lower figure, mind you, conceals some interregional differences. So some states can look pretty awful even now. But nonetheless, these are extremely backward levels of development in terms of human development. Likewise with infrastructure, if you take power generation capacity, about 3,000 megawatts is all you had around 1950. What were your industries? You basically had sugar and textiles and light industrial goods for the most part, cement, sugar, textiles, a bit of steel. You didn't have modern capital goods industries. You didn't have machine making industries or machine tools or any of the larger capital equipment that you can think of. So it's an extremely backward industrial economy. What about infrastructure in terms of transport, communication, energy? Very poor. So whether you look at physical infrastructure like energy, transport, communication, or human resource infrastructure like health and education, things are quite backward. And then, of course, you have uh, extremely backward agriculture, as I mentioned earlier. Plus, you also must know that the state of financial infrastructure was also very poor. You had the RBI, you had the Imperial Bank of India, which later became SBI, but there was hardly any, stellar banking enterprises in India. There were private sector banking enterprises, commercial enterprises, which served a very limited clientele, and so banking had not developed widely and deeply across the country. There was a bit of everything, cooperatives were there and so on, but extremely backward financial infrastructure. And I could go on, I could add more. So the long and short of it is that we started off with a situation where the Indian industrialist or the Indian capitalist class wanted development, but was not in a position to undertake the kind of very large scale investment for infrastructure that would be necessary for development to occur. So they were resigned to the idea that via the Bombay plant that the state should invest in these areas of infrastructure. Ideally, they would have liked the state to lend them money and let them do it and so on. But okay, under the conditions, then the state building infrastructure was taken as legitimate. And they, after all, you must remember that 1950 was a time when the prestige of the USSR was very high, and the remarkable successes in planned economic development. And they came up from being an extremely backward country as late as 1928 to becoming the second largest industrial power by 1940. All these left a big impression on the minds of the national liberation movements across the world. And even in the Western world, some planning was there. Planning was not a bad word then. Planning was something that everybody thought was a good idea. Because many people thought planning should go coexist with a private property dominated economy, and that's the case in most of the world, including India, then and now. So we did, therefore, find acceptance across the entire political spectrum for planned economic development, but always remember that this planning is different from planning under socialism, where the means of production are controlled by society, and therefore the planning can be comprehensive for the entire economy. Here, government can plan for what it can do in terms of investment, but it cannot command the private sector to do likewise. So here it's very partial planning. Some amount of planning can be done by the state, but large part of the economy and most of the means of production are in private hands, and they will decide and they will do as they see fit in terms of the interests of profit maximization. So obviously this is not planning of the Soviet kind. No public ownership of the means of production. But there were some levers of regulation that the state could use, incentives could be offered and so on. So limited amount of intervention was possible. And this was something that was highlighted that we had to have planning. And the 5-year plans came. 5 years is not an imitation of the USSR, but more a reasonable period for planning to occur. And remember, given the difficulties of partition and so on, we started only in 51, and first 5-year plan is largely a collection of already ongoing projects and some putting them together and so on. And the second 5-year plan becomes a very serious and plan in depth. Then the third 5-year plan. With the first 3 plan periods, 1950-51 to 65-66, you could argue that this is a period of serious planning. Once the partition issues had been settled and you became a republic in 1950, you started on your plan development in 1951. There was something which meant that planning was accepted across the political spectrum, but planning within the framework of a capitalist economy. Let me underline. Because the means of production were privately owned, they were not touched, land was privately owned, most of transport, commerce, so much was in private hands. State, in fact, not just then, but even now, and throughout the entire 75-year period, if you look at an indicator like the combined expenditures of the union government and all the state governments put together, this has rarely exceeded 25 to 28% of GDP. The state has always been a relatively minimal player in terms of these kind of metrics. But let's also not underestimate the role of the state. State, a key role, especially in the 50s and 60s, the state played a very key role in initiating development in the in building the necessary infrastructure. Because remember, that while individual capitalists were not able to build infrastructure, all of them needed power, transport, communications, an educated workforce, a healthy workforce. All of that was necessary for all capitalists. And therefore, what the state was doing was delivering to them what they needed at relatively subsidized rates. They were financing capitalist development, but while appearing as state sector, public sector. So public sector was not, an outpost of socialism by any means. It was actually an instrument for creating and nurturing a path of capitalist development, in which the capitalist classes would, of course, at some point assert their dominance, as in fact has happened over the years. So, no illusions needed about the public sector, but nonetheless, public sector was very important for us in terms of affording us some degree of self-reliance. And there are cases that one can talk about, and I think the basic point I want to get across here is that the criteria for assessing the public sector cannot be the same as what you use for just a private sector entity where only profits matter. Public sector was intended to build the economy and provide the infrastructure that the capitalists needed, but which they could not at that point in time build on their own. And therefore, the public sector performed an extremely important function. It enabled growth both by expanding the supplies of intermediate goods and infrastructural services that is critical for private sector development. It also generated income and employment, and therefore demand in the economy. So both on the, if you want to think of it in terms of mainstream economics, both on the demand side and the supply side, public sector investment was crucial for India's development. Public sector investment was the main instrument through which planning operated. So you could say that an important driver of India's economic growth in the period from 1950 to the mid-60s was public sector investments under the various plans. The other important feature of post-independence development, other driver, could say, of development was the putting in place of a trade regime that offered protection to domestic industry, enabling Indian capitalists to produce goods and services, which in the colonial period were all imported. To some extent, some of these could now be produced at home, even if the production, so-called, was in many cases one of the final stage, just completely knocked down conditions being put together or semi-knocked down conditions, whatever. But still, import substitution was the key, one of the key strategies that were adopted. So a foreign trade regime was built in which tariffs were imposed on many products, and there were some outright bans as well, but there was no suggestion that we should not trade. No, that was never on the agenda. We traded, we were getting integrated into the world capitalist economy, but we were also applying some regulations on imports and exports, including quantity regulations, and in some cases we had policies that banned certain kinds of imports, and so on. So, foreign trade was regulated significantly, as was domestic investment. And these two important aspects, public investment and import substitution, were very key drivers of economic growth in that period. Third important driver of economic growth was land reforms. Now, India never had comprehensive land reforms across the country. It didn't break the back of landlordism everywhere, nothing of that sort. Despite the fact that the peasantry played a heroic role in the freedom struggle, and despite the fact that the Congress, the leader of the national movement, had accepted the slogan of land to the tiller, a slogan that the All India Kisan Sabha created in 1936 was very strongly pushing. Again, it is the mass organizations developed by the left forces in this country that created all these new demands in the freedom movement, demands that related to the lives of working people as opposed to simply abstract notions of independence, very concrete notions of employment, of land the tiller, land reforms, some degree of control over the lives for working people. In a sense, therefore, the land reform agenda was very much on the cards. Partly, remember, because we had talked about these major present uprisings. We hadn't talked about the Royal Indian Navy mutiny in 1946, which is very important too, because the Royal Indian Navy mutiny of 1946 is a marker of the extent of disaffection against the prevailing regime among the people. Likewise, the whole rash of industrial strikes and struggles, railway strike, the um, PNT worker strikes, other self-government employees. Across the country, there were major strikes by industrial workers as well around the period of 44 to 47. So this is all part of the pressure I had mentioned earlier behind the urge for planned economic development with the public sector as a key. So public sector investment, import substitution, and limited land reforms. These were the three major drivers of economic growth in the first three planned periods from 1947 or 50 to 66. Why, in what sense would land reforms be a driver of growth? The question that you might ask, especially considering we didn't do any comprehensive land reforms. There was again, if you have listened to class textbook discussions of land reforms, you know that land reforms is three important components. One is this whole question of the abolition of zamindari, absentee landlordism, and the other outmoded structures of the rule of landed gentry. And that was something on which there was a fairly universal political consensus, but when it came to action on the ground, things were far more complicated. And although while there were laws against the abolition of zamindars and also of intermediaries, so-called, and so on, actual implementation was very much a function of the extent to which the mass movement could put pressure on the concerned governments to implement the law. Passing a law is only one step, and even that law can be full of loopholes because the process by which a law is made is one in which the elite, the well-to-do sections have a much larger say than the working poor. Nonetheless, given the climate of those times, there were land reform legislations passed which related to, first of all, the abolition of zamindari and absentee landlordism. They were not abolished in the sense of being expropriated, they were compensated, but nonetheless, there was certainly a decline in the old forms of zamindari and traditional landlordism, certainly. There were huge discussions on what constituted absentee landlordism. In fact, because the attempt was initially to define it in terms of personal cultivation, but then the landlords, upper caste landlords, which never lifted an instrument in their lives, objected to the notion of personal cultivation being defined in terms of physical participation. So there was a big debate around that. All this got diluted. Nonetheless, with all the caveats, one can say that to some extent, zamindari abolition and absentee landlordism legislations had some success across the country. And in many states, they led to new political developments. For example, in the state like the United Provinces, the intermediate castes emerged in this process as an important political force. And, again, I won't go into details, much to be said here. But the second aspect of land reforms was the question of tenurial reforms. So tenants were mostly tenants at will, had little protection, landlords could evict them any time. So one of the most important aspects of land reform was ensuring protection for tenants, tenancy reform. Land reform is important. One component of that was the tenancy reform. And what that entailed was, again, three aspects. One is the making sure that tenants can't be ousted at will. In other words, some degree of protection against eviction is one important aspect of tenancy reform. So security of tenure. The second was the regulation of rent. The rents can't be raised year after year, rack renting should not be allowed, and so on and so forth. And the third was that in cases where generations of the same household had cultivated a land on lease from the same landowner, there was an argument for conferment of ownership or title to land on the cultivating peasant. If the landowner concerned had large amounts of land, some of it could certainly be set apart for this. And you could put ceilings on how much land can be taken over by such landlords and what kind of protection can be given to tenants. So these three elements of tenancy reform: security of tenure, regulation of rent, and conferment of titles in some cases. These are also important issues that were being discussed and fought across the country. Then the third element of land reform, which is the one that got least implemented, you might say, is the element that relates to land ceilings. The notion of land ceilings itself was opposed by many in the landed gentry, who of course advanced the argument that why are you putting a ceiling on our assets? And the capitalists are much larger assets. So of course the point is capitalists are having assets which are reproducible assets. Land is not a reproducible asset in that sense, so there are some differences. Nonetheless, anytime you question private property of landed gentry, this brings into question the legitimacy of capitalist private property in general. That is why after the October Revolution across the world, capitalist classes are not too enthusiastic about comprehensive land reforms. They do not want a land reform process that mobilizes the mass of the peasantry, because it can easily turn against them. And they don't illegitimate what is perceived as their own illegitimate, wealth in large amounts. So in a sense, while in the 19th century bourgeois regimes were, generally pro-land reform, post the Soviet Revolution, the capitalist classes in most countries have been very wary of land reform slogans. There's something that's important historic change that I'm just talking about it in passing. Anyway, we had some land reforms of some kind, and these three: public investment under a regime of limited planning, import substitution, and limited land reforms. These helped unleash, to some extent, the growth of productive forces. Land reforms, in this sense, helped unleash, to some extent, productive forces in the countryside. It gave land tenants an incentive to invest once their tenure was secure. Landlords who were not interested in cultivation earlier, once they saw the writing on the wall, could turn from being feudal landlords to modern capitalist landlords. So from below and from above, these measures would contribute to some growth of productive forces in agriculture. This is the idea behind land reforms. No, it's not an egalitarian drive that inspired land reforms. The need for capitalism itself, its own development, required some modernization of agriculture, growth of productive forces in agriculture, lowering of input costs for industry in terms of both agricultural inputs and in terms of the wages that they had to pay their labor. So, improvement in productivity in food cultivation and all other raw material cultivation, etc. It was very important for industry as well. So, industry as a whole the bourgeoisie was in favor of land reforms, but within very strict limits, without threatening the legitimacy of its own mode of acquiring more and more private property. Anyway, as it turned out, given the compromise that had emerged by this time between the landlords and the capitalists in the countryside, as the then ruling party of the International Congress, the movement of International Congress sought to strengthen its roots in the countryside by courting landlords who had earlier been with the British regime, and therefore Congress was, on paper at least, hostile to them. Although, you'll notice that even throughout the freedom movement, when Mahatma Gandhi never gave a call to move against landlord, he was all for not paying tax to the colonial government, but never for failing to pay interest to the usurer or the rent to the landlord. So, Congress certainly knew which side this bread was buttered, but it was under some compulsion to involve the peasantry in a large way to the freedom movement. They had to accept some degree of land reforms and so on. And also this is necessary for capitalist development. So there was some congruence of interest there. But never mistake these limited land reforms for anything like comprehensive agrarian change, which is what we need to unleash energies in the countryside. Anyway, so these three elements of land reform for tenants, for abolition of housing landlordism, and for land ceilings. Two of them worked reasonably well, but the land ceilings thing remained a non-starter essentially. If you take, for example, some estimates by the late 50s, Professor Mahalanobis, who was at the time director of the ISI, came up with an estimate of ceiling surplus land in India. And you would just be astounded by the figure he came up with. It was 630, we have, India has 400 crore acres of land, by the way. 40 crore acres, 400 million acres, right, of cultivable land. 160 million hectares, 400 million acres. And the estimate of Mahalanobis, based on some assumption of ceilings, reasonable assumption of ceilings and exemptions, was that something like 63 million acres, roughly 1/6 of the cultivable land, 6.3 crore acres, would be ceiling surplus. This is the estimate in the late 50s, early 60s. Till now, we have not even reached a tenth of this amount. And it's unlikely that we're going to get back to the agenda unless there is a big and dramatic political change in this country. And of course, a lot of the land would have been eaten up also in the last 75 years in various ways for buildings of various kinds. But this is the scale, right? And so you can see how land ceilings legislation, first of all, was characterized by huge numbers of loopholes, and secondly, hardly got implemented, except in those states where, well, Jammu and Kashmir for some reason, for some historical reasons, which I'm not going into here, but apart from that, only when the left was in office in some states in the country, like West Bengal, Kerala, and Tripura. Otherwise, most of the, including Karnataka, which much is talked about, there's hardly any implementation of land ceilings legislation or any significant redistribution of land ownership in favor of the poor anywhere in the country, but for these exceptions. So, except for the left-led governments in Jammu and Kashmir for historical reasons, there's been no, significant land redistribution. Redistributive land reforms are a non-starter in India for the most part. Nonetheless, limited as they might have been, these land reforms, plus import substitution and public investment, enabled the process of economic growth for reasons I've explained. So if you take the entire first phase, because this phase sees significant investment by the state in industrial development, in infrastructure. Many of these institutions we are discussing, for example, currently the crisis of the banking system. The crisis of the banking system today has much to do with large-scale infrastructure lending by the banks in the beginning decade of the 2000s. Because by that time, the development banking institutions had been closed down and we were all into universal banking. But in the 50s, the government set up development banking institutions. You had the ICICI, you had the IFCI, you had the IDBI, you had the Unit Trust of India. These are all HTFs. These are all actually intended to promote long-term investment, which carries risk and therefore should carry low interest rates and so on. The state would actually underwrite those kinds of loans. All this enabled, and then of course the RBI, then the banking system, and of course much later the banking reforms in '69. But by and large, the financial infrastructure improved to some extent. Same thing with education and healthcare. And the idea of primary healthcare comes a little later, but still there is a recognition that the state has a responsibility for the health and education of the population. There is a responsibility for infrastructure. Quite a contrast to what we think now that, what can the state do? You die, you die. This is the current philosophy. In the pandemic, where we have been told that nobody died of lack of oxygen, looks like nobody killed anybody. So we're not even going to get into that. But just to set the record straight, there was these three major measures by the state did pave way for some growth. And although this is, heavily hemmed in by the compromise that had been entered into by the capitalistic landlords in the countryside to deliver the votes for the ruling party, there was still some change, some degree of capitalist development occurred in the countryside, industrial development occurred, workers moved from the countryside to towns, and so on. So, there was certainly movement. And a summary of that can be seen in terms of growth rates that we can talk about. I'm already running out of my time. So I'm going to quickly finish this part and do the second half very, very quickly. Basically, between 1900 and 1950, under colonial rule, India's GDP grew at hardly 1% per year. Agriculture grew at one half of 1% per year compound. But in contrast, post-independence, from 1900 to 1950, from 1950 to 1966, the Indian economy grew much faster. At about GDP grew at about 3.5% per annum, sometimes 4%. Industry grew rapidly at about 8%, especially manufacturing, large-scale manufacturing, and small and medium manufacturing. Agriculture itself grew at about 3% per annum, which is higher than the rate of growth of population, unlike the earlier 5 decades. So, overall growth rates and sectoral growth rates were significantly different and higher than was the case under colonial rule. So, anybody who tells you that India's independence meant nothing is wrong. Some of the political ultra left's infantile understanding that 1947 has made no difference would be incorrect. It certainly made a difference. The newly independent economy had some degree of latitude and space to make plans and to implement them with all the class constraints that were part of the regime, but there has been some development, economic development in the three plan periods. And now I come to the point that we need to discuss. Was this sustainable? And essentially what I'm going to say in the remaining maybe 10-15 minutes that I'll take, since we started a little late, I hope I'll be forgiven for continuing to another 10-15 minutes. The crisis of this path of development became evident by the mid-60s. What you must also understand is that the decision to focus on import substitution for domestic industrialization was also not entirely a choice, because at that time, up in the post-World War II period, advanced capitalist countries were substantially focused on European reconstruction. They were not bringing large quantums of investable surpluses here. There was no prospect of expanding exports in a big way, because more than 100 countries had become independent around the same time. So, partly our seemingly, restrictive trade policy was also dictated by the circumstances of that period. Now, for all that, this path ran into three important problems. One was that, in view of the fact that the path of development depended crucially on sustained public investment, question arose, where were the resources to come from for public investment? Since public investment was being conducted in a way that would subsidize and make available intermediate inputs at an affordable rate for the expanding private capitalist sector, public sector investments alone could not be a source of surplus for the public sector itself. Public sector's profitability goals had to be moderated in terms of its larger objective of trying to help the private sector grow. Nonetheless, there was, of course, contribution by the public sector to government surpluses. Government had essentially three sources of surplus. One was public sector enterprises, which delivered surplus to the government, quite a substantial amount, and then taxes, and then charges levied for services provided by the state. The last item was very modest, but where we had a problem was that the state was unwilling politically, perhaps unable politically, given its dependence on the rich to effectively tax those sections of the population that gained substantially from public investment and state initiatives and from the overall economic growth that was occurring at that time. So, given that, the state ran into fiscal constraints because of its inability to raise resources to continue to finance public investment. India's tax GDP ratios have been abysmally low throughout the 75 years that we're talking about. And they were quite low in the 50s and 60s when we didn't even have a proper machinery to collect taxes, and we did not have effective ways to tax the well-to-do, nor did we do what China did, which is actually large-scale land reform, which enabled generation of surplus in the countryside and the building of very substantial infrastructure investments in the countryside. We didn't have that. Absence of land reforms meant the continued monopoly power of the landed gentry, and therefore this both inhibited capitalist development and hugely limited the surpluses available for rural investment by the state. Likewise with industry and manufacturing. So the state was unable to garner the sources for investment on a scale that was required to sustain the rate of economic growth. So there was a contradiction between the role of the state as kind of a resource mobilizer and investor and its role as an instrument for transferring surpluses to private capital. This is also an important function it's playing by subsidizing public sector services provided to the private sector. So there was some kind of a primary accumulation going on where the big capitalist class would be able to use the state apparatus to, gain to enrich itself. Meantime, state would be finding it increasingly difficult to mobilize resources for public investment. And so by the mid 60s, matters reached a head. There were, of course, other factors at work. I'm not discussing all detail. There was a couple of famines, and there was, remember, this is the period of conflict also with neighbors. 1962 India-China war, 1965 the conflict with Pakistan, 2 years successive of drought, and all of that. So in 65-66 the economy ran into a crisis where one important dimension of the crisis I've just mentioned is the crisis of resources for sustaining public investment and therefore for sustaining growth. Second was the fact that although you had import substitution as your strategy, it was a very limited kind of import substitution. You were not able to generate enough technological innovation inside the country to keep replacing imports at all levels, not just the final level, but at all levels. So making production an entirely indigenous process running on its own steam and improving itself over time, that was not happening. And given that your higher growth now, post-independence, itself demanded more imports, inevitably, and given that your exports were not growing anywhere near that rapidly because of the global context of lots of newly independent countries trying to supply the same markets and therefore suffering erosion in terms of trade, something that Raul Prabish and others have talked about. I'm not getting into that here, but certainly we faced the international context was not favorable for us in terms of trade. What this meant was that we also, by the mid 60s, had a balance of payments crisis. So we had, on the one hand, a budgetary crisis, a fiscal crisis, where the state was unable to mobilize resources for further investment on a sustained basis. Second, we had a problem of imports increasing far more rapidly than exports, leading to a balance of payments crisis, for which we went to the IMF to seek some support, and we ended up being pressured by the IMF to devalue the rupee. On the question of public investment being difficult to sustain, the choice that the ruling classes made was to cut back public investment. On the balance payment situation, the decision to go to IMF meant that you took their advice on a very massive devaluation of the Indian currency from rupees 80 paise to the dollar to 7 rupees 50 paise to the dollar. Well, when I say 7 rupees 50 paise to the dollar, that sounds like heaven, right? So it's more like 75. Okay, so Obviously, there were different times, but yeah. So essentially, the second crisis was the balance of payments, and the third, most important crisis, was the successive droughts. Given that the growth in agricultural output that had occurred in the period from 50 to the mid 60s had occurred primarily through expansion in area cultivated and some increase in output per acre on account of irrigation, there were no major technological breakthroughs. And so by the mid 60s, you had in the given the context of the persistence of landlordism in the countryside and the power of the landed gentry, given the limited changes in production relations in the countryside, these stymied the growth of productive forces in agriculture, so that productivity increase in agriculture was nowhere near what you would have needed for increasing food grains output with given amounts of land and so on. So we had actually moved in that direction. We had recognized this, and the Green Revolution was on the agenda. I was hastened also a bit by external circumstances, where the US pushed us into a corner where we had to then quickly implement the Green Revolution, which had already been in the pipeline. But this was to come a little later. So 65, 66, we had a crisis of the budgetary crisis, the fiscal resources crisis. We had a foreign exchange resources crisis, and we had a crisis of agriculture where the um, stagnation in agriculture was not broken through by transforming the relations of production there. And this meant very great difficulties in ensuring increasing supplies of wage goods, food, as well as raw materials for industrial growth. And so there was a whole issue of rising inflation occurring both from government policies and from the crisis on the agrarian front. So essentially, this brought you to the threefold crisis of 1966 of food, foreign exchange, and public investment, or rupee resources, if you like. And the response of the state was distinct for each of these three things. On the issue of resource crisis, the state responded by cutting back public investment. This resulted in a very long industrial recession. So the second half of the period I'm talking about, mid 60s to 80, saw a sharp fall in the rate of growth of industry from 8% to 4% per annum. This is because of the cutback in public investment, which has very huge impacts on private investment. In India, public investment and private investment are complementary, not competitive. Unlike the model that says you're at full employment, therefore any resource taken from public investment is taken away from private investment. On the contrary, private investment in India benefits from public investment and is encouraged by it. So that this cutback in public investment was a huge setback for private investment as well. And so the industrial growth rate fell very sharply. The decision to raise the rupee value of the dollar or to devalue the rupee meant immediately, right off the bat, that this would lead to a sharp rise in prices because you're importing petroleum crude and many other things, and then this devaluation would be a sharp rise in import costs, which will be passed on to the population at large. So already you were suffering because of the agrarian crisis, unemployment, cutback in industrial investment, unemployment, and this government decision to devalue in turn would increase inflation and further worsen unemployment and the economic situation for the people. And this was reflected in the results of the 1967 elections across the country. The Congress party was defeated in 9 states, 8 states. Remarkable. For the first time, you had, Congress party had monopoly of power in center and the states, except for the brief interlude. I'm not talking about Pepsi in the early 50s, but Kerala in 57, 59 had an independent communist government. And of course, at that time, they couldn't even purchase one MLA. Nowadays, the standard norm is to purchase MLAs if you don't get the majority in the elections. And our ruling party has perfected the art. But at that time, since there were communist MLAs, nobody could be purchased. So what
So,
you had to
if you can sort of conclude in the next few minutes.
Yeah, I will be concluding. So we had to basically, we'll catch up, we'll do the arrears next time. But we had to then, therefore, the government of India had to intervene and dismiss the government of Kerala by invoking Article 356. Remember that that government was headed, the Congress party at the time was headed by Mrs. Indira Gandhi, and the government was headed by Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. So, the democratic credentials of these individuals must be seen also in the context of the decision to dismiss the Kerala government of that period. Anyway, again, I can't get into that given the lack of time. But very quickly, what happens in the second half of this period I'm discussing, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. Government response to the three aspects of the crisis: food, foreign exchange, and rupee resources. Was on the food front, they had a relatively successful strategy of the Green Revolution. I will discuss that in more detail maybe next time, because I don't think I can do justice now. But it certainly helped improve India's food grain output with limited area and helped stave off an impending food crisis in the country. And that's a very important intervention, the Green Revolution. It is being, very negatively viewed by ecological fundamentalists. And I'm sure some of the concerns are genuine and need to be addressed. But if we hadn't had the Green Revolution, we would have been in great trouble by now. Nothing, the notion that old methods of production would have yielded great yields is simply fantasy. The Green Revolution made a big difference in terms of increasing output from the given amounts of land that we were devoting to food grains. Now, but that was to come. It was not going to happen overnight. I will discuss that separately. The balance of payments crisis, which led to a devaluation, was disastrous for us in terms of sharp rise in inflation. Likewise, the response to the rupee resources crisis by cutting back on public investment led to a sharp decline in the long-term rate of growth of Indian industry. And none of the recovery, these things didn't recover for a long time. It was only in the late 70s that industrial growth rate recovered. And once again, you were on a somewhat higher growth path. Even then, it was a different composition of industrial output at that time. Likewise, the balance of payments crisis was to some extent salvaged by the Gulf boom and the growth of remittances from abroad. But it also must be admitted that the 70s saw some very unfavorable developments in the international arena for India. A sharp rise in oil prices in 1973 with the formation of OPEC. Again, a second round of sharp rise in oil prices in 1978. So in a sense, the second half of this period, mid-60s to late 70s, was a difficult period. And while we did to some extent succeed in raising food grains output and staving off a major food grain crisis, we were not able to prevent a sharp slowdown in industrial growth rates and therefore also in employment growth. Likewise, we were not able to deal with the forex crisis in a manner that would have enabled us to expand our ability to buy imports and improve our forex earnings. That didn't happen at all. So we continue to be always threatened by a potential forex crisis, a balance of payments crisis, and a potential food grain crisis. And these came to a head in 1917 and 18, and I'm not going to it here. But the series of developments, and of course, I'm not even discussing the emergency, since Gautam has told me to leave some time for questions. Maybe we should spend a bit of time tomorrow on this, or next time on this. But all this is a very packed period, 65 to 80, and characterized by many adverse developments in the economy and in the polity, at the end of which we enter the 1980s, and that's a wholly distinct period. So we will discuss that. It's going to be difficult because there is so much that's happening. 80 to 2014 is what I'll have to cover in the next session. But whatever I've left out today, some of it may come in the questions, but I will catch up some of this in the next session. But for now, story of 50 to 80, the story of an attempt at self-reliant development under relatively favorable circumstances, relatively autonomous capitalist development, when India became independent, given the global context and given the domestic urgency of development agenda. But this is a path of development riddled with contradictions, given the fact that the Indian capitalist class was not willing to carry out comprehensive land reforms and break the power of landlordism. It intended to compromise with the landlords, and therefore countryside relations did not change significantly. That put a dampener on your agricultural growth and marketable surpluses and so on. Likewise, your inability to break through domestic S&T and innovation and improve import substitution led to a balance of payment crisis. And in the absence, of course, at that time of capital flows in aid and so on, you're very quickly in a crisis. And the basic regime, which sought to transfer resources from the state to the capitalist class, people's resources were to be transferred by the state to the capitalist class, obviously did not help in enabling us to sustain public investment. The tax regime, the fiscal regime, was more geared towards providing surpluses to the capitalist classes than to providing surpluses for public investments in the country. I'll stop there. There's much more to be discussed, but maybe we'll do it in the next session briefly. Okay? Gautam, is that all right, or you want me to, can I continue for some more time? This is okay? All right. We'll give some time for questions. Yeah. Okay. It's too much packed into 3 lectures.
Thank you, sir. Like we understand, it's a extremely long topic which has to be compressed in 3 lectures, and it's something that's it's quite difficult, and we're putting you in a difficult position. But maybe it'll come up in questions, and we can take up a few of these things in the next lecture. So I'll just kick off the proceedings of the questions, which with one question from my side, and then we'll go to the comments. So there's been a lot of especially now there's a lot of anathema of what about planning. Planning is a bad word, but if you could talk about why planning was a very important, why it was necessary for a newly decolonized country to set up in some sense of planning, and you also have experiences of at the same time you also have experiences of other especially the East Asian countries, which in some sense had a similar trajectory but have turned out in a very different manner. So in that sense, what did some of these countries do right, and where did we go wrong? And also, how would you sort of evaluate the success of India's the first phase of the planning phase till 80s and mid 80s, and its failures after a point? How do you sort of evaluate it? Yeah.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't even say that I can talk about the success of planning through the 80s. I think essentially serious planning ended with the end of the third 5-year plan. The crisis of the mid 60s was the beginning of the devaluation of planning in Indian polity among the ruling classes, among the policymakers. Also remember that while the growth of the economy may have suffered because of lack of resources in the government's hands, the Indian capitalists had grown bigger by then. So they were able to generate resources to a much greater extent than they were able to do so at the time we became independent. So planning was very important. Planning and public investment, always together, planning and public investment. Planning provided a certain direction to the economy, which of course the private sector by itself would never have been able to give. And this is an accepted idea at that time because of the sheer prestige of the Soviet experiment time. And of course, it's part of the national movement. I mean, after all, the Indian National Congress created this planning committee in 1938, and as Ashok Rao often reminds me, Nehru attended practically every one of its meetings. There was 76 meetings or so until it was disbanded many years later. So, it is obviously the Congress that has great importance to planning as part of the national movement, had that legacy. So in a sense, there was not much objection to planning. Even the Bombay Plan recognizes, by the very title Bombay Plan, recognizes the idea of planning. And this is true not only of India, but it's even true of more advanced countries like France and Britain, which had indicative planning, where in fact there's also the whole rage at that time of nationalization of steel, of railways, of transport, so on. So, it was a different climate altogether. Soviet successes had led to a different perception of the role of the state in even advanced capitalist countries, although of course the US remained the exception. But there I want to keep reminding you that the rhetoric about the role of the state should be distinguished from the actuality of the state having always been there to back up the capitalist class, including in the 19th century. So, entire imperial system wouldn't have existed without the support the color, the state. So anyway, that is a separate analytical question. But to come back to this, yes, I would say that the planning of the period to mid 60s was important in making possible autonomous growth in India, which lasted for right through the 80s. And in fact, even the so-called crisis in 91, which has made the reason for bringing in reforms, there was really no crisis. I mean, India did very well in the economic growth. And this had a lot to do with the one component of the strategy which worked out right, so the Green Revolution component of the strategy, which actually enabled you to move labor force from countryside to town, it enabled you to feed a growing population with less area under cultivation. One can talk about the long-term consequences. One can talk about whether, we had serious problems in not having extension services that would address ecological issues to the extent that they should have addressed them. But those are secondary. I mean, basically, the cutback in public investment and the devaluation both considerably hampered the possibility of reviving growth in the second half of the 60s and through the 1970s, further made worse by the international context of rising oil prices and so on. Also remember that this is an interesting era. I mean, I didn't talk about it when I gave the lecture, but if you look at 1974, the 43rd General Assembly session of the UN, the 37th, sorry, and you have this resolution coming up there put forward by developing countries and socialist countries for a new international economic order. So the climate at that time was, of some assertion, especially following OPEC and so on. But we never had anything equivalent to that for us to gain from some consolidation of the third world. That didn't last very long because by 86 we had gone to the ninth round of the WTO negotiations. They ended up with WTO, which is far worse. So a brief interlude, presence of the USSR and rival socialist camp enabled us to bargain. And you see this, I didn't again discuss this question of what was the US response to India's leadership in the online movement and its position on Vietnam when the US invaded Vietnam. That, in a sense, hastened your Green Revolution strategy because in the mid 60s, the US was saying, why should we give you grains when you're, opposing us on the question of Vietnam? And so we had to hurry with our Green Revolution strategy. So, the economic, food sovereignty was necessary for economic sovereignty. That's something we realized in that period. But I'm a little uncomfortable using the term we. The ruling class is a perception. They operate from that perception. But when we talk to students, we say we, India, so in that sense, in that larger sense, yes, the Indian economy, the Indian economic system, if you like, did grow through this period, 60s and 70s. It didn't stop growing. In fact, if you look at the GDP growth rate, 50 to 80, it's roughly about 3% plus, much higher than the pre-independence growth rate. So capitalist development didn't get completely stopped. It grew, but the second half grew at less rate than the first half. Crisis really comes, crisis has to be discussed, but when I say crisis in 1780, it is more of a limited phenomenon. That in that particular year, there was a very severe drought. Agricultural output fell by 18%, and inflation rose very sharply by 21%. The price index rose by 21%. So the Janata regime got completely discredited. It enabled the return of Mrs. Gandhi, who had been, defeated massively in the post-emergency election. So these are all, so many flip-flops in the 70s, which are political and economic, and I just cannot do justice to that complexity in a short period. So in my longer set of lectures, I do that. I take a lot of time to discuss this period. So, yeah.
Thank you, sir. Now let's go to the audience questions. The first is by Mrinal, who's asking about what are the factors that are hindering the working class of India from uniting for their class interest and not of different belief systems. I mean, it's a
This
very
is a
broad
huge
question.
question, right? This is a huge question, and I think it's a question that all of us are trying to answer. And so Brunal is welcome to join us in the search for the answer. But I think it's important to flag a few points. First of all, you have, you can't underestimate the ruling classes. Ruling classes have huge resources in their arsenal. And that resource, when I say resources, they include not just financial resources, but also ideologies that divide people. And you are talking about a society which is riven by divisive ideologies, caste or whatever from that level. Through, of course, now the great Hindutva divider, which is dividing working people. Uh, Religion and caste have played an important role. Linguistic nationalities in this country are distinct, and it's not so easy to bring a countrywide unity. But what you must also see is that compared to 1920, when the AITC was first formed, today, in the reform period, last 30 years, 91 to 2021, the Indian working class, the Indian trade union movement has launched so many all India general strikes and carried them out successfully. There is really a much greater sense of an all India working class, all India trade union movement than ever was earlier. You should not underestimate it. It doesn't make the headlines. See, one of the problems we have is the media hardly carry any news of remarkable advances in building working class unity across the country. Likewise with the Kisans. They'll only wake up when the Kisan movement enters Mumbai. Otherwise, it doesn't exist for them. So, we also should not fall prey to that. There are massive efforts, and they've been going on for many years. And it's difficult. One of the points maybe I should make to Mrinal is that the context in which the Indian working class was formed, industrial working class was formed in India, was under a colonial system where there were three major class enemies: landlords, the capitalists of Indian and foreign industry, and then the colonial state, and which was buttressing British capital. The workers tended to be recruited through, Kanganis, or they were contracted from different parts of the country, with no organic links among them, speaking different languages, coming from different villages, and even people speaking the same language from different villages won't interact easily. So, building working class unity under these conditions was something, an extraordinary challenge. I think we might benefit from reading Sukamal Sen's classic work on the growth of the working class movement in India. He also links it to the national movement for freedom. The other important reference would be R.P. Dutt, get an idea of what conditions were like under British India and what it meant for organizing working people. But Sukamal Sen would be a good starting point for understanding the complexities of even organizing trade unions, let alone working class political movements. What is remarkable, and this is not often commented upon, is that working within the framework of a parliamentary system, communist movement in this country has managed to be in office, I wouldn't say in power, be in office at the level of state governments over territories which have several million people. This is larger than populations of most countries. So this is an achievement we tend to not realize because we take it for granted. But to be able to rule over, to be able to run the state government in Kerala or Bengal or Tripura, for whatever length of time you may have done it, is something equivalent to 100 Venezuelas, if you like. I mean, I don't want to put it crudely. I'm just saying one must have a sense of proportion that building working class unity across the country is an enormously challenging task. I understand the anxiety and I appreciate the anxiety and the shared concern, but I also think we should not get used to the idea that these are not that easy, but worth doing for all of that.
Thank you, sir. I think it's some question that we're all thinking of every day. So,
Yeah.
next is from Gautam, who's asking that with increasing privatization, what will be the future of the prospect of control and regulation in the country?
Yes, at the moment, certainly we are in a regime of fairly substantial deregulation. So, regulation has become much weaker in the economy. You can see it also in the way the state can't even put together numbers about the economy. They don't even have, sources of data to coordinate what's happening in the economy, to know what's happening. So government's numbers are basically, you don't even look at them because there's no credibility now, or almost no credibility. Yes, it's going to be a big challenge. I think, I'm only hoping that this aggressive path of privatization will not last forever, and that we are on the way to. You see, there's a fashion in India as well. When neoliberalism gets discredited in the West, it might take us a decade to understand that it has been discredited, as it happened with how we adapted it earlier. So I think that there is considerable resistance as the Modi regime will find to mindless privatization. It doesn't seem so at the moment because you are, seeing the government being very aggressive. But I want to give you some inputs that I was going to say for the later lecture, which is that if you looked at the degree of disinvestment from 91 onwards, 91 to 96, disinvestment is very, very small in terms of annual amounts of disinvestment. 96, 97, 97, 98 was the UF period where hardly any disinvestment took place. Then 98, 2004, it is a 13-day wonder, a 13-month wonder, and then the full-term government of the Vajpayee dispensation. That was when the annual quantum of disinvestment increased massively, hugely. Okay, there was a pushback in 2004 as long as the UPA was dependent on the support of the left from outside. Like, all this is going to come later, but since you raised the question, I want us not to throw in the towel too easily. 2004 period, we were able to push back privatization to a significant extent, and the rate of privatization was far, far smaller. Again, once Manmohan Singh got free of this bonded labor to left, as he once proudly said, I don't know how the social media people forget what Manmohan Singh was like just a few years ago. He was delirious when he had got rid of the left. The second part, the second term of the UPA 2, the rate of disinvestment increased significantly. But nothing comparable to the disinvestment under the Modi regime from 2014 to 21. So we are right now in the middle of the peak of the disinvestment regime. So we are naturally thinking, my God, at this rate, there will be no publicity to the left. It's not that easy. It's not going to happen overnight, and we are not going to let it happen. I mean, it's a fight, right? It's a fight that will go on. So, but the point is well taken that if this happens increasingly, then there will be no regulation, no control, and also extremely difficult. I mean, what is the meaning of social justice if all your industry is privatized? Just imagine what that means. All your companies, and everything goes in the private sector, no reservations. This is the BJP agenda, right? But they talk about reservation state level for political purposes. They can play different games. But if you're pushing privatization on a large scale, you're essentially saying that they can't guarantee employment to the socially oppressed anymore. That's so there'll be resistance. It won't be that easy. There'll be resistance. We'll have different forms, and of course it'll be difficult. I'm not saying it'll be easy. Across the world, if Joe Biden can say that I'm going to invest a huge amount in infrastructure, and I'm going to tax the corporates at a higher rate than so far for that purpose, we are, in a world which is contested. I don't claim. Some people say, oh, neoliberalism has, got weakened and all that. I'm not ready to make exaggerated claims on the extent to which neoliberalism has been delegitimized, even in the Western world. But there is clearly a pushback, clearly a global fight hotting up between the neoliberals and those who believe in the necessity of state regulation of economies. So that's a long ongoing battle that will happen. Yeah. No, you're not audible. Go to
What led what
sorry.
led to the reforms? What led to the failure of land reforms in India, except in the select few states? The left states, the Jammu and Kashmir, those kind of states.
The short answer would be landlord power, and the fact that the capitalist class was in alliance with the landlords, that India's big capital was unwilling to confront landlords. They wanted land reforms, but in a way that wouldn't unleash people's forces. Because if land reforms occur through popular mobilization, then that creates a consciousness which can be potentially threatening to the capitalist class as well. And in fact, land reforms that succeed, as they did to some extent in Bengal and Kerala, did not succeed through GOs. because the peasants had occupied lands in the 1967 government in Bengal. In 77, they were able to tell you which plot of land belonged to whom and who was cultivating what. So it is a mass movement on the ground as much as the state as such, which enabled some degree of success in the Operation Barga and in the distribution of ceiling surplus land. But we know that that's only the beginning. It's a very small part. We can't even end with that because it's tiny plots of land. What do you do with it? You need much more further steps to make land reforms viable in any particular territory. Um, Across the country, I give you an example of Tamil Nadu, right? Tamil Nadu is an example. But recently also there's been a lot of noise about the Dravidian model and how Tamil Nadu, the Dravidian movement has carried out land reforms and broken the back of landlordism and all that. It's a bit over the top, I would say. Not entirely untrue, but a bit over the top. Tamil Nadu, it is true that in the 50s and 60s, Congress was in power till 67, right? At that time, land reform legislations were on. Ceilings, particularly, were on at that time, and the landlords were very powerful. They got the whole ceilings issue debated for long enough for them to hide their lands in the name of dogs and cats and relatives. And they also built colleges, which meant they could escape land ceilings, and they'd also get hostels funded by UGC, and their grain would get a ready market in the hostel students. So, landlords are pretty smart in tackling land reform. These are landlords of the Tanjavur region that is being talked about. But except for small areas where the communist movement was powerful enough to ensure some distribution of ceiling surplus land. It happened in the East Tanjavur district, Tanjavur, Nagapattinam and Mailaduthurai, which is where the left has been powerful, and where it is true that in the 50s, some sections of the Dravidian movement cadre also worked with the communists. But it's not the Dravidian movement abolished landlordism. That's a bit of a strong statement. When the DMK came to office, before coming to office, the DMK had actually made this point that Congress is not serious about land reforms. They had coined a nice catchy slogan for that. But when they came to office and they passed acts on land reforms and land ceilings and all that, but till date, you have hardly 2 lakh acres of land which has been taken over and distributed in Tamil Nadu ceiling surplus. And N. Shankaraya, who turned 100 a few days ago, had spoken at the Kisan conference in 1980, listing all the temple lands and saying that these ceiling surplus lands in Tamil Nadu would be of the order of 20 lakh acres, not 2 lakh acres. So in Tamil Nadu also is quite a laggard in that, So this is interesting because the people see there's no whole school of thought that doesn't believe land reforms are necessary, including maybe people like Jean Dress, I'm not sure. But I can't really say that about him. But I know that there are many people who think Tamil Nadu model offers an alternative to the Kerala model, and it's better because capitalists can be happy. So, but I think it's a bit more complicated than that. I think that landlord power and the compromise between the bourgeoisie and landlords, especially the big bourgeoisie and landlords, was key to land reforms being stymied in India. And the fact that we were not able to, the left was not able to mount a powerful enough offensive across the country. I mean, obviously, we had been powerful, all this wouldn't have happened, right? So, yeah.
Okay. Next is by Bhavya, who's asking how do you see the role of state in the growing income inequality during the pandemic period? I think
Can
it's
we
true
save
for
it for the third lecture?
yeah. Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
if you don't mind, Bhavya.
Yes, yes, I think makes sense. In fact, even the next question that we have is probably related to the next session that we have. It's about how the LPG, the liberalization, privatization, and
How did it come
globalization,
about?
has it affected the socio-economic position of marginalized group. I think that's something.
Yeah,
Do you want to
absolutely.
take it right now,
No,
or
no,
do you
second lecture,
want to take it
second lecture.
next lecture? Right,
Definitely.
right, right.
I
Okay.
promise you it'll be there. It's one way of making sure you come. Yeah.
Okay, I think that's it for today. Okay, there's one more. There's one more just come. It's from Arun, who's asking, what was the experience of the states that did implement land reform, even if in a limited form? Were they able to generate surplus in the rural economy?
Yeah, it's a good question. See, if you take West Bengal, land reforms may not generate surplus for the state, but they did enable a lot of petty producers to produce and sell in the market. And the state came in to some extent in terms of price support and then input support and so on. So one of the things you find in West Bengal, for example, I did an article by Madhura Swaminathan and somebody else in EPW, maybe Vikas, I'm not sure, somebody else, in the mid-90s, in around 2000 or so in EPW, which tells you that if you take Operation Barga and land reform, ceiling surplus, land being distributed, the rate of growth of agriculture in West Bengal was among the highest. I mean, it grew very rapidly from the late 80s through the mid 90s. Subsequently, there's no significant cooperativization, no significant consolidation. State government was under severe fiscal stresses. It didn't sustain the process of agrarian reform in the manner it should have. Looking back, one can be critical about it. And many other factors intervened. And remember that a state like West Bengal, the left government of West Bengal, is always under the radar from government of India. So in terms of resources shared or transferred, all those constraints come in, but none of that should be an excuse. I think we probably should have done more about sustaining those land reforms in Bengal and sustaining agricultural growth. That is one of our inability to cope with that challenge there. In Kerala, the quantum of land taken over as ceiling surplus is very limited. Kerala has very limited amount of land which is cultivable. I mean, the whole topography is such that cultivable land is at a premium. But what was successful in Kerala was the breaking the back of Janmi landlordism through the legislations there, tenancy legislation especially. But even the tenancy legislation had the limitations. They didn't always put land in the hands of the actual cultivator. And people have made these criticisms about the land reforms on the left. Nevertheless, I think the land reform in Kerala enabled landless agricultural labor to strengthen its bargaining power immensely, given that Kudigina Puha legislation, which gave 10 cents of, for land to every household, which enabled them to withstand the power of landed gentry and build the agricultural labor movement. So, agricultural labor wage rates in Kerala are far higher than elsewhere. Before the Gulf boom, not just after the Gulf boom, by the way. So you can't simply link it to the Gulf boom. The Gulf boom helps, but even before the Gulf boom, the wage rates in Kerala have been significantly higher. And this is to do with the land reforms, among other things, many other measures the state took under the left. But remember also that in Kerala, left was never consistently in office. So that's a serious limitation. Despite that, they managed to get quite a few things done. That is also important for us in understanding the need for tactics that carry people beyond party lines with you. General public has to come to you, even if the UDF is ruling or whatever. Some measures UDF can't do anything about. In Tamil Nadu, much is made about how the Dravidian model has helped. But what I would say in Tamil Nadu again is the popular mobilization of class and mass organizations in Tamil Nadu, which has made it difficult for every successive government to go back and renege on earlier welfare measures. So that is an important lesson there. So I think, I'm going from one topic to another, but I think these are important lessons that you have in the Indian experience. Pointers, at least.
Okay, so I think that's the end of the questions. I'll pass.
Can I ask if this is too fast for the participants, or the speed of delivery and all that? Clarity, is that okay? What do you feel like sitting in the studio? Was it clear? Was it loud enough?
It's clear.
Slow
It's
enough?
clear. No,
Was it slow enough?
It's very clear. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because the tendency is to go quite rapidly. That's why I'm checking. I'm trying very hard to restrain myself, but don't always succeed. Yeah.
So I'll just invite Chirita to give the final word of thanks, and thank you, sir.
Oh, unmute yourself.
Sorry. I'm sorry. So we are officially going to wind up the session. Hope all people are here safe and healthy. We really had a great lecture, and it's our first session of the lecture series, which was really very informative. So, thanking Professor Venkatesh Athreya for this wonderful session, and participants, viewers, and also the moderators here. Really, thanks to all. We really looking forward to the feedbacks. And if you have any, if the participants have any queries, requests, or something, please let us know. We will be connecting with Professor, and we'll definitely get back to you as soon as possible. And our next session will be held on 31st of July, 6:30. Please do join us. And once again, thanks to all.
Thank you. And with your permission, I'll exit.